So an overview of the endocrine system is how we'll start. I'll present the hypothalamus and the pituitary gland, and then we'll do an activity with the other endocrine glands, an interactive one. Later, we'll talk about the hormones, their structures, and their actions. We'll also cover stress and adaptation, icosanoids and paracrine signaling, and we'll touch on endocrine disorders as well at the end. So we talked about the nervous system, which is cell communication. So yeah, there's lots of communication in the body already with the nervous system. You might be thinking to yourself, well, then why do we require a whole separate communication system? That's really what the endocrine system is. It's a communication system. Cells talk to each other all the time. And you can imagine that is true because your muscles are all individual cells, but they contract at the same time. I mean, there is coordinated contraction. So cell communication is necessary for the integration of cell activities, for them to work together. And there's various ways in which to do that. One way is with gap junctions. That's direct communication. Cytoplasm and proteins and some smaller particles can move simply between one cell to another. So a gap junction is a pore. Oops, sorry, wrong color. Gap junctions are pores in cell membranes for cell-to-cell signaling. For cell-to-cell signaling. There are other cell-to-cell communications. Neurotransmitters. It's a communication system using neurotransmitters. And one similarity between the nervous system and the endocrine system is that some of those neurotransmitters are also hormones, like dopamine and norepinephrine. Yeah. And they just cross a very small gap, the synaptic cleft. They're not generally released into the bloodstream, although sometimes they are. That's just an exception. So there are local hormones. So the paracrine system is a local hormone system, just, knocking on the neighbor's door type of thing. So paracrine are local hormones. So they're secreted into tissue, signaling nearby cells. So prostaglandins are a hormone like that. So prostaglandins cause smooth muscle to contract. So there are even prostaglandins in the semen of males, so that it's thought it helps the uterine muscle to contract a little bit and help the sperm on the way to the uterine duct. Prostaglandins. Technically, hormones, the type of hormones that we're talking about, endocrine hormones, are chemical messengers that travel in the bloodstream. Thereby, they're widespread. They're widespread around the body. So the hormone is released into the bloodstream. So this is a diagram showing blood vessels. This is a system. These are the endocrine cells releasing the hormone. And these are the target cells somewhere in the rest of the body receiving the hormone. So target cells have receptors. And the receptors are specific for certain hormones. Testosterone and estrogen look very much alike, but they bind to different receptors. The endocrine system includes a whole bunch of organs. Endocrine organs like the thyroid, the thymus, the pineal gland, the pancreas, the testes, the ovaries, the pituitary, the hypothalamus, the hypothalamus is very important. Probably controls the whole thing, really, or mostly, anyway. Let's take a look. Did I catch them all? Let's see. Yep, I think so. The hypothalamus, the pituitary, the pineal gland, they are all in the brain. The thyroid gland is right here on top of your trachea. The parathyroid glands, oh, I didn't mention those. The parathyroid glands are on top of the thyroid. The thymus is just above your heart. The adrenal glands sit right on top of the kidneys. And the pancreas is next to the first part of the small intestines, because the pancreas functions not only in hormone secretion, insulin and glucagon, but also in the secretion of digestive enzymes. And of course, the gonads. Yeah, so the comment was the heart secretes hormones. There are other structures of the body, including the kidney and the heart and some other ones, that do secrete hormones. They're not technically part of the endocrine system, but I will talk about them. So it's a bit of a gray area, what constitutes the actual endocrine system. So I'll break it into the endocrine organs being the endocrine system, and then other structures also producing hormones. So how do those hormones get into the blood? Through glands. And there are two kinds, endocrine and exocrine, inner and outer, kind of, you might be able to call them. So exocrine glands all have ducts. ducts carry secretions. In our case, we're talking about hormones to the body surface. Or other organ cavity. And these have extracellular effects. So they don't affect cells in particular. Like food digestion and sweat. So really the only hormone that would be instrumental in being secreted outside the body would be pheromones. Humans do produce pheromones, and they're excreted by either sweat glands or apocrine glands. So not technically part of our endocrine system. Endocrine glands have no ducts. They secrete hormones into tissue fluid. It's sometimes known as extracellular fluid, ECF, from where it is taken into the blood. So wait, no, not blood. Capillaries take up hormones into blood and distribute. To the rest of the body. Endocrine system, all endocrine glands other organs, heart, the brain, the small intestines, they also secrete hormones. You could call that all part of the endocrine system, really. There isn't really a cut and dried definitive break there. So we'll talk about all of them. What is the difference? Why do we need these two systems? Why do we need the nervous system and the endocrine system? It's insane. Well, let's look at some similarities and differences and why we might need both. The nervous system communicates by chemicals and electrical methods. Yeah, hormones in breast milk. So they are an exocrine duct, yes. So the endocrine system, however, doesn't have any electrical signaling. So the endocrine system uses only chemicals. Speed. Which do you think is faster? You can write that in the chat. Which do you think is faster? The nervous system. Yes, the nervous system is considerably faster. So the nervous system, I'll just put NS. 1 to 10 milliseconds, and stops quickly. The endocrine system effects can be weeks. Reactions could be within seconds or within days. And effects may continue for weeks. Yeah, so it's a longer lasting system. Adaptations, nervous system adapts very quickly. But the endocrine system does not. It is more persistent. In order for hormones to be to decline, they need to be taken up by other organs or excreted from the system. So that takes some time. The area of effect, the nervous system, is quite immediate. Nervous system, targeted and specific. But the endocrine system has more widespread general kinds of effects. When you think about controlling glucose, for example, all of the cells in the body require glucose. So let's look at a diagram comparing these two systems. The nervous system, one neuron, neurotransmitters, the target cells. Target cells may be other neurons, or they may be muscle cells, or they may be glands. And the endocrine system, cells excreting hormones into the blood, and the blood distributing those hormones to target cells, the rest of the body. But of course, only target cells that have the receptors for that particular hormone. So some similarities between the two systems are that some chemicals function as both, so that's very handy. Norepinephrine is one. Dopamine that we mentioned before. ADH, which stands for antidiuretic hormone. And some others as well. Some hormones are even secreted by what are known as neuroendocrine cells. They're neurons, but this is one of those exceptions. They excrete neurotransmitters, or in this case, they'll be acting as hormones, into the bloodstream. So oxytocin is one of those. And catecholamines. And both systems have overlapping effects on some target cells. So, for example, in between meals, if you require some sugar for energy, then both norepinephrine and glucagon from the pancreas cause glycogen hydrolysis in the liver, releasing the simple sugar, glucose, for uptake by cells for cellular respiration and the production of ATP. And they regulate each other. So neurons can trigger hormone secretion, And hormones can stimulate or inhibit neurons. So they do work together sometimes. Block isn't a good word. We always use the word inhibit before. Yeah, so they work together, although they're somewhat different. Yeah, so the hypothalamus. The hypothalamus is kind of shaped a bit like a funnel. It forms the floor and the walls of the third ventricle. And it regulates our primitive survival functions, homeostasis. I'm not sure why the word primitive is used sometimes, but it just really means that they are the types of functions that have been around in our ancestors' for a very long time. So survival. So all of our ancestors obviously survived to reproduce. And in the end, we were born. So I think that's why it's called primitive. Although, of course, it doesn't mean that it was only necessary way back. It's obviously a very necessary function for survival now. So these functions for survival are anything from water balance to sex drive, but many of those functions are carried out by the pituitary gland. So the hypothalamus triggers the pituitary gland to release hormones. The pituitary, if you recall from the brain dissection, is directly below the hypothalamus. There are a couple of ways in which that happens. Interestingly, there are two lobes to the pituitary gland, and they develop from different embryonic tissue, one from above and one from below, the posterior and anterior pituitary. So we'll definitely be talking about that. Yeah, so here's the anterior and here's the posterior pituitary, connected to the hypothalamus. The pituitary gland is also known as the hypophysis. Hypophysis. So here's the hypothalamus up here, and the anterior pituitary here, and the posterior pituitary here. So in the hypothalamus, there are what are known as neurosecretory cells. And they produce hormones in the hypothalamus, but they deliver them to the posterior pituitary from where they get distributed. And those are two different hormones from the posterior pituitary, and those are ADH and oxytocin. ADH, which is also known as antidiuretic hormone, and ADH helps to function to regulate water balance. And oxytocin, as we said before, is instrumental in milk production in the mammary glands, the uterine muscles, for contraction and nurturing behavior. You know, it's very interesting because right outside my door here, there's a heron colony, and I watched the herons, and I have been recording them for a long time, and made a documentary and all that kind of stuff. And they are seasonally monogamous, so they're just together for a season, the male and the female. But at first, the male is really dominated by testosterone when they first start to bond, and are really aggressive to all the other males. But eventually, the vasopressin, and another hormone too, takes over, and the male becomes more nurturing, and then is less aggressive, so other birds can build nests closer to their nest. Embryonic development of the pituitary. Well, so in this case, a pouch is being formed. Happens at about 4 weeks, or 8 weeks rather. And in the fetus, both are already formed. So the two kinds of tissue that contribute are from below and from above. So really, it's a diencephalon kind of budding. It's called a neurohypophyseal bud. And then that becomes a pouch, and that becomes the pituitary. Yeah. So from below, the tissue migrates upward. Let's take a look at the neurohypophysis. That includes the hypothalamo-hypophyseal tract. These are the tracts through which the neurons travel. But the cells, the cell bodies of the neurons, are in the hypothalamus. An extension of the hypothalamus, producing oxytocin, antidiuretic hormone, and releasing into the pituitary, the posterior pituitary lobe. So the posterior lobe and the anterior lobe have two names. So I always get them mixed up, so I have to really make sure we get these ones right. Yeah, so the anterior lobe is the adenohypophysis, and the posterior lobe is the neurohypophysis. So the whole system is known as the hypophysis, but the adenohypophysis is anterior, and the neurohypophysis is posterior. And it's aptly named neurohypophysis because that is the system of neurons that travel along a tract to release their hormones. Yeah. So that's one system. The other system is quite complex. It's called the hypothalamo-hypophyseal portal system, in which case the hormones are released into capillaries and then transported through blood vessels into the anterior pituitary. So the hormones that are released from the hypothalamus are usually called releasing hormones because they're released into the pituitary, the anterior pituitary, and cause other hormones to be released. So they are called gonadotropin, releasing hormone, or GRH, and it controls from the anterior pituitary the release of FSH and LH. And we'll talk about those in a sec. There's the thyrotropin releasing hormone, corticotropin releasing hormone, prolactin releasing hormone, prolactin inhibiting hormone, GH releasing hormone, GH stands for growth hormone, and somatostatin. So let me write some notes about that. This is a little bit convoluted, the diagram itself. So let me write some notes. There are 5 releasing hormones that stimulate the anterior pituitary to secrete hormones. And there are 2 inhibiting hormones. And they suppress secretion of the hormone from the pituitary. So I have a nice diagram that shows this very clearly. I really like this diagram. The hypothalamus, a thyroid releasing hormone, gonadotropin releasing hormone, corticotropin releasing hormone. So the hormones that are released by the anterior pituitary in response are prolactin. Its target is the mammary gland, a thyroid stimulating hormone. Its target is the thyroid. LH and FSH target are the testes and the ovaries, respectively. What is that called again? Adenocorticotropic hormone. That's a long one. I'm going to write that out. Adrenocorticotropic. That is not the longest word in the English language. The longest word is disanti-establishmentarianism. That's what that stands for. PRL is prolactin. Growth hormone, which is taken up by the liver, but also fat, muscle, and bone. And there is a subsequent hormone that's released in order to stimulate growth. There is another structure called the pars intermedia, but they're absent from an adult human, but present in the fetus. They produce POMC, pro-opiomelanocortin, which is processed into the hormones that are used by the adult, and produces MSH that influences pigmentation of the syn, melatonin stimulating hormone, the skin, hair, or feathers, but apparently not present or functioning in humans. The posterior lobe is a little bit different in that neurons produce the hormones and then they're released into the posterior pituitary. So let's look at some actions. FSH, also known as follicle stimulating hormone. Its targets are the ovaries, and it stimulates the production of eggs and follicles. And we're going to talk about that more in the reproductive system. In males, the target is the testes, and it stimulates sperm production. LH is also known as luteinizing hormone. In females, it stimulates ovulation and the corpus luteum. To secrete progesterone and estrogen. And we'll be looking at those in the reproductive system. In the male, the hormone stimulates a different kind of cell, interstitial cells, in the testes to produce testosterone. And TSH is a thyroid stimulating hormone. And it stimulates growth of the thyroid gland and release of thyroid hormones. So these are all anterior lobe. Corticotropins respond to stress. To stress from injury, for example. And they stimulate the adrenal cortex to secrete corticosteroids. They are delivered into the body to regulate glucose, fat, and protein metabolism. So for when you're exercising, for example, you need more ATP, you need more energy. Your body is under stress because you're exercising, and then the adrenal cortex secretes the corticosteroids required for more sugar. Prolactin. In the female, stimulates milk synthesis after delivery, and in a male, it increases sensitivity to luteinizing hormone. And thus, increased testosterone secretion. The growth hormone is secreted by somatotropes. So the types of cells that secrete the releasing hormones are generally named after the hormones that they secrete. So these are somatotropes, and they produce somatotropin, which promotes growth, tissue growth. So it directly affects mitosis and cellular differentiation. So not only the dividing of cells, but it stimulates what those cells are to become. The function of the growth hormone and IGF. Protein synthesis. So it increases DNA transcription. And proteins are synthesized. It stimulates lipid metabolism. So if you are starving, for example, and you require energy and you've used up all the glycogen in your liver, which is really only a day's worth, then you will start to burn fat. So lipid metabolism is when you need energy from fat. And electrolyte balance in the body is largely controlled also by IGF. So growth, of course, is extremely important in childhood and adolescence. So the growth is mostly of bone, cartilage, and muscle. In adulthood, bone gets restructured. So the bone that you use that has a lot of use gets more growth, and bone can even decrease. So bone thickening and remodeling in response to use. There's higher levels during, when do you have the most high levels of growth hormone? First 2 hours of sleep, when presumably you're replenishing the use of a lot of your required glucose. After high protein meals, and after vigorous exercise. So those were all anterior hormones. Posterior pituitary hormones are ADH and oxytocin. It's a little more straightforward, really. ADH targets the kidneys to increase water retention and reduce urine. It also functions as a neurotransmitter. But the main focus of ADH is to control water uptake in the kidneys. And oxytocin, labor contractions, lactation. There's a possible role in sperm transport and emotional bonding. How is the pituitary controlled? There are controls of the anterior lobe, controls of the posterior lobe. So for example, let's see, what is this example? Oh, this is the thyroid example. So your hypothalamus is releasing thyroid releasing hormone. The pituitary gland is releasing thyroid stimulating hormone, which goes to the thyroid itself. And then the thyroid releases its hormone to target organs. But if there is a large amount of that hormone, it sends feedback signals both to the hypothalamus and the pituitary. And that keeps an overabundance of the thyroid hormone from being released into the body. Okay, so that is really all I want to talk about at the moment. So thank you for watching once again.